They say love makes you blind, but sometimes it's the people we trust most who push us toward the edge of the abyss. She had given up everything for him, her career, her independence, her very identity, all for the promise of forever. But forever has a price, and some men are willing to pay it in blood. When the foundation of your life crumbles beneath you, you have two choices: fall into the darkness or fight your way back to the light. This is the story of a woman who refused to die quietly. A woman who discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sleeping beside you. And when that enemy underestimated her strength, her intelligence, and her will to survive, he made the last mistake of his life. Because there is nothing more terrifying than a mother protecting her child, and nothing more powerful than a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The autumn wind whipped through the streets of Manhattan 40 stories below as Isabella Rodriguez stood on the terrace of her penthouse, her silk robe billowing around her 7-month pregnant form. The city sparkled like a constellation of earthbound stars, each light representing lives she would never know, dreams she would never share, secrets she would never uncover. At 32, Isabella possessed the kind of timeless beauty that pregnancy had only enhanced: her dark hair cascading in lustrous waves past her shoulders, her olive skin glowing with that coveted maternal radiance that made strangers smile at her on the street. Her manicured hand rested protectively on the gentle swell of her belly, where her unborn son performed his nightly acrobatics with increasing vigor. Dr. Phillips had assured her that such active movement was a sign of a healthy, strong baby, destined to enter the world with the same determination that had made his father one of America's most successful media moguls. "Soon, little one," she whispered into the crisp October air, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the wind. "Everything is almost ready for you." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, Isabella could see the nursery she had spent the better part of 3 months perfecting. Every detail had been chosen with meticulous care and unlimited resources: the hand-carved mahogany crib imported from a centuries-old workshop in Tuscany, silk curtains embroidered with golden stars by artisans in Lyon, first-edition volumes of classic children's literature bound in leather and displayed in custom-built shelves that would one day hold the treasures of a lifetime of reading. The walls were painted in soft sage green, gender-neutral but sophisticated, and adorned with original watercolor illustrations commissioned from one of Isabella's favorite artists. No expense had been spared for the future heir to the Wellington fortune. Marcus had insisted on that from the moment they learned of the pregnancy. "Our son will have everything I never had," he'd said, his steel gray eyes softening with an emotion Isabella had rarely seen in her husband's carefully controlled features. "He'll never want for anything, not love, not opportunity, not security." Marcus Wellington had built his empire from absolutely nothing, transforming himself from the son of a small-town mechanic into the commanding presence who now controlled Wellington Media Empire, a multimedia conglomerate that spanned television networks, digital platforms, publishing houses, and film production companies. At 45, he generated over $500 million annually and commanded respect in every boardroom he entered, his mere presence capable of making or breaking careers with a single word or gesture. To the outside world, Marcus and Isabella Wellington represented the pinnacle of American success, the perfect power couple whose love story had been chronicled in glossy magazine spreads and society columns from Manhattan to Malibu. She was the brilliant former investigative journalist who had captured the heart of America's most eligible bachelor. He was the self-made titan who had proven that love could conquer even the most carefully guarded heart. Their courtship had been a masterclass in romantic perfection, at least according to the narrative carefully crafted by Marcus's publicity team. They had met at the annual Autumn Gala for the Children's Hospital of New York, one of the city's most prestigious charity events, where Isabella was covering the proceedings for Metropolitan Weekly, the respected investigative magazine where she had built her reputation exposing corruption in politics in corporate America. Isabella remembered that night with crystalline clarity how striking Marcus had appeared across the crowded ballroom. His tall frame impeccably dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, his silver-streaked hair catching the light from the enormous crystal chandeliers. But what had truly captured her attention was not his obvious wealth or commanding presence, but the way he had listened during the evening's speeches about childhood poverty and medical access. While other affluent guests had chatted quietly or checked their phones, Marcus had focused intently on every word, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. When the silent auction began, Isabella had positioned herself strategically to observe the bidding patterns, a professional habit that often revealed more about a person's character than any interview could. Marcus had bid aggressively on items that would directly benefit the hospital: a week at a pediatric medical conference in Switzerland, a consultation with a renowned child psychologist, an endowment for a new wing dedicated to cancer treatment. He had shown no interest in the luxury items that attracted most donors: the vacation packages, the artwork, the exclusive dining experiences. "You're watching the bidders instead of the auction," a voice had said behind her, and Isabella had turned to find Marcus Wellington himself, two glasses of champagne in his hands and an amused expression on his aristocratic features. "Most journalists are," Isabella had replied, accepting the champagne with a gracious smile. "People reveal their true priorities when they think they're not being observed." "And what do my priorities reveal about me?" Marcus had asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than the performative interest she usually encountered at such events. Isabella had studied him for a moment, noting the way he held himself with confidence but without arrogance, the way his attention remained focused on her despite the countless interruptions that typically plagued high-profile individuals at public events. "That you understand the difference between charity and investment," she had said finally. "Most people here are buying status. You're buying impact." Marcus had laughed, a rich, genuine sound that had surprised her with its warmth. "You're very perceptive, Ms. Rodriguez." "Isabella Rodriguez from Metropolitan Weekly. And you don't need me to tell you who you are, Mr. Wellington." "No," he had agreed, "but I'd very much like you to tell me what you think about everything else." The conversation that followed had been unlike any Isabella had experienced with a subject before. Marcus had asked thoughtful questions about her investigative work, displaying an impressive understanding of the complex financial systems she often scrutinized. He had shared insights about the media industry that revealed both his business acumen and his genuine concern for journalistic integrity. Most surprisingly, he had seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, asking follow-up questions and challenging her perspectives in ways that sharpened rather than undermined her arguments. When the gala ended, Marcus had asked if she would join him for coffee the following afternoon. "Not for an interview," he had clarified with a smile that made her pulse quicken. "Just to continue the conversation." Their courtship had unfolded like a fairy tale orchestrated by the gods of romance themselves. Marcus had pursued Isabella with the same focused intensity he brought to his business ventures, but always with a gentleness that made her feel cherished rather than conquered. He had sent books by her favorite authors with handwritten notes discussing passages that had reminded him of their conversations. He had arranged private tours of museum exhibitions that aligned with her interests in art history and social justice. He had remembered details from their talks: her favorite type of cuisine, her thoughts on obscure films, her childhood memories of summers spent with her grandmother in Barcelona. Within 3 months, Isabella found herself completely captivated by this man who seemed to see and appreciate every aspect of her personality. Marcus encouraged her to pursue challenging stories, often providing contacts and resources that enhanced her investigative work. He attended her award ceremonies and article launches with obvious pride, introducing her to his influential friends as the most talented journalist in America, rather than simply as his girlfriend. When he proposed on the rooftop of the Metropolitan Museum of Art at sunset, with the entire city sprawled beneath them, and a string quartet playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, her favorite piece of classical music, Isabella felt as though she had discovered what true love actually meant. The ring was a vintage Cartier piece from the 1920s, not because it was expensive, but because Marcus had remembered her mentioning that she preferred the artistry of vintage jewelry to modern designs. "I want to spend my life learning everything about you," he had said as he knelt on one knee, his voice thick with emotion. I want to support your dreams, celebrate your victories, and build something beautiful together. Will you marry me? Isabella. She had said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face as she realized that all her cynicism about modern romance had been wrong. True partnership did exist. Genuine love was possible. She had found both in Marcus Wellington. Their wedding had been featured on the cover of Vanity Fair, a tasteful ceremony at the Wellington estate in the Hamptons, attended by celebrities, politicians, and industry leaders, but somehow maintaining an intimate atmosphere that felt personal rather than performative. Isabella's dress had been a custom creation by Vera Wang, inspired by vintage Hollywood glamour, but updated with modern touches that reflected Isabella's independent spirit. Marcus had written his own vows, speaking eloquently about how Isabella had taught him that success meant nothing without someone to share it with, someone who challenged him to be better than he thought possible. The first year of their marriage had exceeded even Isabella's most optimistic expectations. Marcus had been attentive without being possessive, supportive without being controlling. He had encouraged Isabella to continue her investigative work, even when it meant long hours and dangerous assignments. When she had been threatened by subjects of her corruption exposés, Marcus had quietly arranged for professional security without making her feel weak or incapable. He had surprised her with thoughtful gestures that revealed how carefully he paid attention to her needs and desires. When she mentioned missing the small cafe near her old apartment, he had arranged for the owner to cater a private breakfast in their penthouse. When she expressed frustration about the challenges facing independent journalism, he had established a foundation to provide grants for investigative reporting, asking only that Isabella help select the recipients. Most importantly, Marcus had shown genuine interest in starting a family. When Isabella expressed concerns about balancing motherhood with her career, he had immediately offered to hire the best childcare available and rearrange his schedule to ensure their child would have active, present parents. When she worried about the health risks associated with pregnancy at 31, he had arranged consultations with the best maternal health specialists in the country. When Isabella announced her pregnancy 6 months ago, Marcus's joy had seemed absolutely authentic. He had actually cried when they heard the heartbeat during their first ultrasound appointment, holding Isabella's hand and whispering that he had never imagined he could love someone he hadn't even met. He had immediately begun reading every book about fatherhood he could find, attending prenatal classes with religious dedication, and planning every detail of their son's future with the enthusiasm of a man who had discovered his true purpose. But now, standing on the terrace of their penthouse in the gathering dusk, Isabella could no longer ignore the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in their relationship. The shift had been subtle at first, so gradual that she had initially attributed it to the normal stresses of pregnancy and Marcus's demanding work schedule. But her instincts, sharpened by years of investigative journalism, were screaming that the changes in her husband's behavior represented something far more sinister than professional pressure or expectant father nerves. The first warning sign had been almost laughably small, a receipt for Tiffany & Co. that had fallen from Marcus's jacket pocket while Isabella was gathering clothes for the dry cleaner. When she had mentioned it casually over dinner, suggesting perhaps he was planning another surprise for the baby's nursery, Marcus had smiled and deflected with a comment about keeping some mystery in the relationship. Isabella had found the response charming at the time, even romantic. But weeks had passed without any gift appearing, and when Isabella had mentioned the receipt again in passing, Marcus had looked genuinely confused, as though he had no memory of the conversation or the purchase. A successful businessman with Marcus's attention to detail didn't simply forget about expensive jewelry purchases, especially not when his pregnant wife had specifically mentioned them. The second red flag had been more troubling changes in Marcus's communication patterns that violated every established routine of their relationship. Throughout their courtship and marriage, Marcus had been almost obsessively accessible to Isabella. He had taken her calls during board meetings, responded to her texts within minutes regardless of his schedule, and maintained constant communication during business trips. Isabella had sometimes joked that she felt guilty about how available he made himself to her, given his professional responsibilities. But recently, Marcus's phone had been going straight to voicemail for hours at a time. His text responses had become delayed and perfunctory. When Isabella called his office, Patricia, his longtime assistant who had always been warm and chatty, had become evasive and uncomfortable, offering vague explanations about Marcus being in conference or out of the building that didn't align with the schedule Isabella had helped him plan. Most concerning of all, Marcus had begun exhibiting subtle signs of deception that Isabella recognized from years of interviewing unreliable sources. He had developed a habit of avoiding direct eye contact when discussing his whereabouts, touching his face unconsciously when explaining delays in his schedule, and providing unnecessarily detailed explanations for simple questions about his day. The night that changed everything had begun like dozens of others during Marcus's recent pattern of distant behavior. He had returned from a 3-day business trip to Los Angeles, claiming exhaustion and heading directly to his home office to catch up on urgent emails that couldn't wait until morning. Isabella had prepared his favorite dinner, osso buco with saffron risotto, made from a recipe she had learned from his Italian grandmother during their honeymoon in Tuscany, but Marcus had barely touched the meal. Claiming that airline food had upset his stomach, Isabella had tried to engage him in conversation about the trip, asking about the meetings and potential deals that had required his personal attention. But Marcus had responded with distracted, monosyllabic answers that conveyed none of his usual enthusiasm for business victories. When she mentioned that Dr. Phillips had asked her to discuss birth planning preferences with him, Marcus had muttered something about addressing it later and excused himself to make urgent calls to Asia. As Isabella cleaned up the kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of Marcus settling into his office routine, she had tried to rationalize his behavior. Building a media empire required constant attention and sacrifice. The pressures of impending fatherhood could affect men in unexpected ways. Perhaps she was being overly sensitive due to pregnancy hormones and the natural anxiety that accompanied bringing a new life into the world. But as she loaded their fine china into the dishwasher, Isabella heard Marcus's voice through the closed office door, and the tone made her freeze in place. Gone was the clipped, professional manner he used with business associates and employees. Instead, his voice carried a softness, an intimacy, that she hadn't heard directed toward her in months. "Baby, I miss you so much," Marcus was saying, his words clear despite the barrier of the heavy oak door. "This pretending is killing me. I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore." Isabella's hands began to shake as she set down the delicate plate she'd been holding, her mind racing to find an innocent explanation for what she was hearing. Perhaps Marcus was speaking to his sister, who lived in Seattle and often called late in the evening. Perhaps he was talking to his elderly mother, who had been struggling with loneliness since his father's death 2 years earlier. But even as Isabella tried to rationalize the conversation, she knew with growing certainty that neither his sister nor his mother would inspire the particular quality of tenderness she was hearing in her husband's voice. "Victoria, sweetheart, you have to trust me," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that carried clearly through the silence of their penthouse. "After Isabella gives birth, I'll file for divorce immediately. My lawyer already has the papers drawn up and ready to file. I've been moving assets into offshore accounts for months. She won't get a penny more than legally required, and I've made sure that won't be much." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Isabella processed the words that were destroying everything she thought she knew about her life. The plate slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence of her universe imploding. But Marcus continued speaking, apparently unaware that his wife was listening to him plan her destruction with the same methodical precision he brought to hostile corporate takeovers. "I know it's hard, Victoria, but just a few more months of this charade," Marcus said, his voice now carrying the kind of cold calculation Isabella had heard him use when discussing the elimination of business competitors. "Once the baby comes and I establish legal paternity for custody purposes, Isabella will have an unfortunate accident, nothing that can be traced back to us. Of course, maybe a slip in the shower, a fall down the stairs. These things happen to new mothers all the time, Postpartum depression leads to tragic accidents every day. Isabella's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the granite countertop to keep from collapsing to the floor. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as though responding to her distress, and she pressed her hand to her belly as bile rose in her throat. The man she loved, the man she had trusted with her life and future, was calmly planning her murder with the same attention to detail he applied to media acquisitions and profit maximization. "The Maldives house is ready for us," Marcus continued, his voice warm with anticipation. "I can't wait to wake up with you there every morning, knowing we'll never have to sneak around again. You're going to be such a perfect stepmother to our son, Victoria. He'll never remember Isabella. You'll be the only mother he's ever known." Our son, the possessive pronoun, hit Isabella like a physical blow, driving home the reality that in Marcus's mind, she was already dead and buried. Just an inconvenient obstacle standing between him and his real life with this woman named Victoria. Isabella forced herself to breathe slowly and quietly, fighting against the urge to vomit or scream or burst through the office door to confront the stranger who had been masquerading as her husband. Instead, she drew upon every technique she had learned during years of undercover investigative work, compartmentalizing her emotions and focusing on gathering information that might save her life and her child's future. "I've already established the timeline," Marcus was saying, his voice now purely businesslike as he discussed logistics. "Isabella's due date is December 15th. I'll let her recover from delivery for 2 or 3 weeks, long enough to avoid suspicion, but not long enough for her to regain her full strength. New mothers are naturally clumsy and exhausted. An accident during that window will seem completely believable." Isabella crept closer to the office door, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Marcus would hear it. Through the slight gap between the door and the frame, she could see him pacing behind his desk, a wireless headset allowing him to gesture expressively as he spoke. "The inheritance laws are clear," Marcus continued. "As long as the baby survives and I maintain custody, I'll have access to all the trust funds and investments. Isabella's family has money too. Her grandfather's real estate holdings in Barcelona are worth at least 50 million. Once she's gone, and I'm the grieving widower raising our son alone, nobody will question my decisions about relocating or managing assets." The calculating cruelty in his voice was almost more shocking than the murder plot itself. Marcus wasn't just planning to kill her. He was planning to profit from her death and steal her family's generational wealth while raising her son to believe his father was a hero and his mother was a tragic memory. "Victoria, darling, I promise you this will all be worth it," Marcus said, his tone shifting back to intimate affection. "By next Christmas, we'll be living openly as a family. Our son will have everything money can buy, and we'll have each other without any secrets or pretending. I love you more than I ever thought possible." Isabella pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Those were the same words Marcus had whispered to her on their wedding night, the same promises he had made when she announced her pregnancy, the same vows of devotion that had made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. How long had he been planning this? How many months had he looked into her eyes and lied about loving her while secretly arranging her death? How many times had he kissed her belly and spoken lovingly to their unborn son while plotting to make that child an orphan? "I need to go," Marcus said suddenly. "Isabella might start wondering what's taking so long. But Victoria, I want you to know that every day I spend pretending to be happy with her just makes me more grateful for what we have together. Soon, darling. Very soon." Isabella heard the call ending and forced herself to move quickly and silently back to the kitchen. By the time Marcus emerged from his office 10 minutes later, she was sitting at the breakfast bar with a cup of herbal tea, scrolling through pregnancy websites on her tablet as though she had spent the entire evening researching nursery decor and birthing techniques. "Sorry about that," Marcus said, leaning down to kiss the top of her head with the same casual affection he had always shown. "Conference call with our Tokyo partners. The time difference makes scheduling impossible." Isabella looked up at him with what she hoped appeared to be mild interest, rather than the terror and revulsion that were coursing through her system. "How did it go?" "Very well," Marcus replied, helping himself to a bottle of water from the refrigerator. "We're expanding into 3 new markets next quarter. It's going to require a lot of travel and long hours, but the payoff will be enormous." He settled onto the stool beside her, placing his hand on her belly in the gentle gesture that had always made her feel cherished and protected. Now, his touch made her skin crawl as she realized he was probably calculating how much longer he would have to maintain the pretense. "How's our little soccer player tonight?" Marcus asked, rubbing small circles over the spot where the baby was kicking. "Active," Isabella managed to say, forcing herself not to pull away from his touch. "Dr. Phillips says that's a good sign." "Dr. Phillips," Marcus repeated thoughtfully. "We should discuss birth planning with her soon. I want to make sure we have the best possible medical team for delivery." Isabella nodded, wondering if Marcus was already researching which medical complications might provide convenient cover for an accidental death during childbirth. The thought made her stomach churn, but she kept her expression calm and interested. "I love you, Isabella," Marcus said, leaning over to kiss her gently. "I can't wait to meet our son and start this new chapter of our lives together." The words that had once filled her with joy now sounded like a death sentence. Isabella forced herself to smile and return the kiss, tasting lies and betrayal on lips that had once promised her forever. "I love you too," she whispered, and realized she was saying goodbye to the man she thought she had married, the life she thought she was living, and the future she thought they were building together. As Marcus headed to their bedroom, whistling softly under his breath, Isabella remained at the breakfast bar, staring at her reflection in the dark window and trying to process the magnitude of her situation. She was 7 months pregnant, financially dependent on a man who was planning to murder her, isolated from her former professional contacts, and facing an enemy who had months to perfect his strategy while she was just learning that a war was being fought for her life. But beneath the terror and betrayal, something else was stirring in Isabella's mind, a cold, analytical fury that reminded her of why she had once been one of New York's most feared investigative journalists. Marcus and this Victoria woman had made a crucial mistake. They had underestimated the woman they were plotting against. Isabella Rodriguez had built her career on exposing corruption, following complex money trails, and bringing down powerful men who thought they were untouchable. She had infiltrated criminal organizations, survived death threats, and toppled corporate empires with nothing more than her intelligence, determination, and refusal to be intimidated by wealth or power. Marcus had fallen in love with the woman she had become, the refined socialite who attended charity galas and planned dinner parties. But underneath that carefully cultivated exterior was the investigative journalist who had never lost a case, never failed to expose the truth, and never allowed a criminal to escape justice. The war was just beginning, and Isabella intended to win. The transformation began before dawn the next morning, while Marcus slept peacefully beside her, probably dreaming of his future with Victoria and unaware that his wife was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and methodically planning her survival. Years of investigative work had taught Isabella that emotion was the enemy of effective strategy. Grief, rage, and betrayal were luxuries she couldn't afford, not when her life and her child's future depended on her ability to think clearly and act decisively. Isabella forced herself to catalog everything she knew about Marcus's behavior patterns, business relationships, and daily routines. She mentally reviewed their financial arrangements, legal documents, and social connections, looking for vulnerabilities she could exploit and resources she could access without arousing suspicion. Most importantly, she began planning how to maintain the facade of loving wife while secretly gathering evidence that could save her life. The first challenge was controlling her physical responses to Marcus's presence. When he woke and reached for her with the casual intimacy of a devoted husband, Isabella had to fight every instinct that screamed at her to recoil from his touch. Instead, she forced herself to snuggle closer, to smile when he kissed her forehead, to discuss their plans for the day as though she hadn't heard him plotting her murder just hours earlier. I'm thinking we should interview some potential nannies soon, Marcus mentioned over breakfast, his tone carrying the same thoughtful consideration he had always shown for practical matters. You'll need help after the delivery, especially during the first few months. Isabella buttered her toast with steady hands, wondering if this nanny would be the one to stage her accident or if Marcus was planning to handle the murder personally. That's very thoughtful of you, she replied, maintaining the gentle smile that had always made Marcus's eyes soften with affection. Do you have any specific preferences for the type of care we should provide? Someone experienced with newborns, obviously, Marcus said, scrolling through emails on his phone with practiced efficiency. But I think we should prioritize discretion and loyalty over credentials. I want someone who understands that our family's privacy is paramount. Someone who won't ask questions when I disappear, Isabella translated mentally, but she nodded as though his concerns were perfectly reasonable. I'll start researching agencies today. Maybe we could interview candidates next week. Perfect, Marcus agreed, leaning over to kiss her cheek before standing to leave for the office. I have dinner meetings tonight, so don't wait up. But tomorrow evening is completely clear. Maybe we could go through the nursery together and make sure everything is exactly right for our son. Isabella watched him gather his briefcase and suit jacket, moving with the confident efficiency that had always made her feel secure and protected. Now, every gesture seemed calculated, every kindness tainted with ulterior motives. Marcus, she called as he reached the door, and he turned back with the attentive expression that had always made her feel heard and valued. Yes, sweetheart. I love you, Isabella said, forcing warmth into her voice while studying his reaction carefully. I know work is stressful right now, but I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you're doing for our family. Marcus's smile seemed genuine, his eyes crinkling with what appeared to be authentic affection. I love you too, Isabella, more than you'll ever know. Everything I do is for you and our son. The ease with which he delivered such lies was perhaps more chilling than the murder plot itself. This wasn't a man struggling with guilt or internal conflict. This was someone who could compartmentalize his emotions so completely that he genuinely seemed to believe his own deception. After Marcus left for the office, Isabella allowed herself exactly 15 minutes to sit in their bedroom and process the full magnitude of her situation. She permitted herself to cry, to feel the devastating pain of betrayal, to mourn the death of the marriage she thought she had and the future she thought they were building together. Then, she methodically washed her face, applied fresh makeup, and began the most important investigation of her career. The first step was determining how much time she had before Marcus's timeline became actionable. Based on his conversation with Victoria, Isabella calculated that she had approximately 2 months before delivery, followed by another 2 to 3 weeks of recovery before Marcus would stage her accident. That gave her roughly 10 to 11 weeks to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy and protect herself and her child. The second step was establishing secure communication channels that Marcus couldn't monitor. Isabella had always maintained her own cell phone and email accounts, but she now had to assume that everything was being tracked. Using techniques she had learned during her investigative journalism career, Isabella established new accounts using public computers at various Manhattan libraries, creating a network of secure communications that would be invisible to casual surveillance. The third step was the most dangerous, beginning active surveillance of her own husband while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic life. Isabella needed to gather concrete evidence of Marcus's affair, his murder plot, and any other criminal activities that might provide additional leverage. But she also needed to avoid any behavior that might alert Marcus to her knowledge of his plans. Isabella's first major breakthrough came during Marcus's next business dinner. Instead of waiting at home as she normally would, Isabella hired a car service and discreetly followed Marcus from their penthouse to an expensive restaurant in Soho. Using skills she had developed during corporate espionage investigations, Isabella positioned herself at the restaurant's bar with a clear view of Marcus's table, disguised behind oversized sunglasses and a hooded coat that concealed her distinctive hair and pregnant silhouette. The woman joining Marcus for dinner was even more stunning in person than Isabella had expected. Victoria Sterling appeared to be in her late 20s, with platinum blonde hair styled in perfect waves, a figure that suggested both natural beauty and surgical enhancement, and the kind of effortless elegance that came from expensive clothing and professional styling. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most beautiful woman in any room, and her interaction with Marcus radiated the kind of intimate familiarity that could only come from months of close relationship. But what struck Isabella most forcefully was not Victoria's obvious beauty. It was the way Marcus transformed in her presence. Gone was the controlled, somewhat distant demeanor he had exhibited at home recently. Instead, Marcus became animated, leaning across the table to touch Victoria's hand, laughing at her comments with genuine delight, gazing at her with an intensity that Isabella hadn't seen directed toward herself in months. This was how Marcus had looked at Isabella during their courtship, completely captivated, utterly focused, radiating the kind of all-consuming attraction that made everything else in the room fade into irrelevance. Seeing that expression directed toward another woman while Isabella sat alone at the bar, pregnant with his child, was almost more devastating than learning about the murder plot. Through careful observation and strategic positioning, Isabella was able to photograph the couple using her phone's zoom function, capturing images that clearly documented their intimate body language and obvious romantic involvement. More importantly, she overheard fragments of their conversation that provided crucial intelligence about their plans and timeline. "The accounts in the Cayman Islands are almost ready," Victoria was saying during a lull in the restaurant's ambient noise. "Daddy's contacts there will ensure everything stays clean once we make the transfer." Marcus nodded, his expression serious as he discussed logistics. "The lawyer says we need to wait until after paternity is established before moving the larger assets, but the initial transfers can happen any time after the birth." "And the other matter?" Victoria asked delicately, her voice dropping to a whisper that Isabella had to strain to hear. "Handled," Marcus replied grimly. "The investigator I hired specializes in domestic accidents. It will look completely natural, just a tragic slip in the shower during those difficult first weeks of new motherhood." Isabella's blood turned to ice as she realized Marcus had already hired a professional to kill her. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous decision. It was a carefully orchestrated murder plot involving multiple conspirators and significant financial planning. Victoria reached across the table to squeeze Marcus's hand, her expression radiating satisfaction. "I can't wait to start our real life together, and our son will have everything: the best schools, the best connections, unlimited opportunities." Our son, again, the casual appropriation of Isabella's child, the complete erasure of her existence from their future plans. Victoria wasn't just stealing Isabella's husband, she was planning to steal her identity, her child, and her life itself. The surveillance operation yielded another crucial piece of information when Isabella followed the couple after dinner. Instead of separating to maintain their secret, Marcus and Victoria went together to a luxury hotel just 6 blocks from the restaurant. Isabella positioned herself in the lobby with a clear view of the elevators and witnessed Marcus using a key card to access the penthouse floor, evidence that he had been maintaining a permanent residence for their affair. Over the following weeks, Isabella developed a comprehensive surveillance routine that allowed her to monitor Marcus's activities without arousing suspicion. She discovered that the couple met regularly at the hotel, that Victoria had a key to their penthouse and visited frequently during Isabella's prenatal appointments, and that Marcus had been gradually transferring assets to offshore accounts for at least 6 months, suggesting that the murder plot had been in development since early in Isabella's pregnancy. The most shocking discovery came when Isabella hired a private investigator to research Victoria Sterling's background. Using contacts from her journalism career, Isabella engaged Elena Vasquez, a former colleague who had transitioned from investigative reporting to legal practice and now specialized in high-stakes divorce cases involving complex financial fraud. "Victoria Sterling doesn't exist," Elena reported during their clandestine meeting at a coffee shop in Greenwich Village. "The name is an alias. Her real identity is Victoria Blackwood, and she's the daughter of Richard Blackwood, a white-collar criminal currently on the FBI's most wanted list for running an international money laundering operation worth over $2 billion. The revelation transformed Isabella's understanding of the entire conspiracy. This wasn't just about adultery and greed. Marcus had become involved with the daughter of a major criminal, and Victoria was using their relationship to launder her father's illegal proceeds through Wellington Media Empire's legitimate business operations. Marcus might be a willing participant, or he might be another victim of Victoria's manipulation. Elena continued, spreading financial documents across the small table between them. But either way, he's now complicit in major federal crimes. The money laundering alone carries a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Isabella studied the evidence. Elena had gathered bank records showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies, communication records demonstrating Victoria's connections to known criminal organizations, and background checks revealing her father's extensive criminal history. This changes everything, Isabella said, her mind racing through the implications. If Victoria is using Marcus to launder money, she has as much incentive to eliminate me as he does. I'm not just facing a cheating husband, I'm dealing with an organized criminal conspiracy. Elena nodded grimly. And that means the stakes are much higher than personal betrayal. If Victoria is willing to commit murder to protect her father's operation, you're in significantly more danger than we initially realized. The close calls began almost immediately after Isabella's surveillance activities intensified. Marcus started asking pointed questions about Isabella's daily activities, claiming concern for her health but clearly fishing for information about her whereabouts and social interactions. He insisted on reviewing her phone calls and became suspicious when she mentioned taking longer walks, claiming she needed exercise for pregnancy wellness. Dr. Phillips mentioned that you should be limiting physical activity, Marcus said one evening, his tone carrying a subtle edge that Isabella had never heard before. All this running around the city isn't good for the baby, especially in your third trimester. Isabella had never discussed her walking routine with Dr. Phillips, which meant Marcus was either lying about the medical advice or he was monitoring her appointments and activities more closely than she had realized. I've just been getting a little restless staying in the penthouse all day, Isabella replied carefully, watching Marcus's expression for signs of suspicion. But you're right, I should probably be more careful about overdoing it. Marcus's smile seemed forced, his eyes studying her with the kind of analytical attention she recognized from his business negotiations. I worry about you, Isabella, and with the baby coming so soon, I want to make sure you're taking every precaution to stay safe. Hannah, the word safe carried an unmistakable irony that made Isabella's skin crawl, but she nodded obediently and promised to limit her activities to prenatal appointments and necessary errands. The most terrifying close call occurred when Victoria herself appeared at the penthouse while Isabella was reviewing legal documents Elena had prepared. Isabella heard the private elevator chime and barely had time to hide the evidence under a cookbook before the doors opened to reveal Victoria Sterling standing in her hallway with a key to her home. "Oh!" Victoria exclaimed, her blue eyes widening with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Marcus didn't mention you'd be home this afternoon. I was just stopping by to pick up some files from his office." Isabella forced herself to smile naturally while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Of course. I don't think we've been formally introduced. I'm Isabella." "Querida Victoria Sterling," the woman replied, extending a perfectly manicured hand with confidence that suggested she felt completely comfortable in Isabella's home. "I work with Marcus on international acquisitions and market development." They stood in the foyer for a moment, and Isabella felt the weight of Victoria's assessment. Up close, Victoria was even more stunning than the surveillance photos had suggested. Her beauty was the kind that required serious money to maintain, with flawless skin, perfect teeth, and the subtle enhancements that only the most expensive cosmetic procedures could achieve. But there was something predatory in her gaze, a calculating intelligence that confirmed Isabella's worst fears about what this woman was capable of. "When are you due?" Victoria asked, her eyes dropping to Isabella's belly with an expression that was anything but maternal interest. "About 6 weeks," Isabella replied, instinctively taking a step backward. "How exciting," Victoria said, her smile not reaching her eyes. Marcus talks about the baby constantly. He's going to be such a devoted father. I'm sure he'll do absolutely anything to protect his child and ensure the baby has the best possible future. The threat was unmistakable, delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested Victoria had no doubt about her ability to eliminate any obstacles to her plans. Isabella realized she was facing someone who had probably been involved in violence before, someone who viewed murder as simply another business transaction. Marcus is very protective of his family, Isabella agreed, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her system. He's always made it clear that family comes first in his priorities. Victoria's smile widened slightly, as though she found Isabella's words amusing. Yes, I've noticed that about him. Marcus is very focused when he sets his mind on something, very determined to achieve his goals, regardless of any complications that might arise. After Victoria left moving through the penthouse with the familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time there, Isabella immediately called Elena. She knows that I know, Isabella reported, her hands shaking as she recounted the encounter. The way she looked at me, the things she said, she's making it clear that any attempt to interfere with their plans will have consequences. Then we need to accelerate our timeline, Elena replied urgently. If they suspect you're aware of their intentions, they might decide to move up their schedule. Do you have somewhere safe you could stay until we can arrange legal protection? Not without alerting Marcus that something has changed, Isabella said, one hand protectively covering her belly as the baby kicked restlessly. But I have an idea about how to end this on our terms, in a way that ensures both Victoria and Marcus face justice for what they're planning. Isabella had been obsessively monitoring Marcus's professional schedule, looking for an opportunity to expose him publicly in a way that would provide maximum protection for herself and her child. The perfect opportunity presented itself in the form of an email from Marcus's assistant regarding his upcoming appearance on Business Tonight, the most watched business program in America, with a live audience of over 15 million viewers. Marcus was scheduled to discuss Wellington Media Empire's expansion into emerging international markets, presenting himself as a visionary entrepreneur leading American business into the global future. But Isabella had a very different educational opportunity in mind for the viewing audience. It's incredibly risky, Elena warned during their strategy session at a secure location. If this goes wrong, if the evidence doesn't hold up under live scrutiny, Marcus will know exactly what you've discovered. There won't be any possibility of trying a different approach. There's already no going back, Isabella replied, her hand resting on her belly as she felt her son's strong kicks. My child deserves a chance to grow up with a mother who fought for him, who refused to be a victim. Whatever happens, I won't disappear quietly into whatever grave Marcus has planned for me. Elena spent the next week coaching Isabella on legal terminology and helping her practice presenting complex financial evidence in terms that a television audience could understand quickly. They also brought in James Chen, a former FBI cybersecurity specialist who now worked as a private digital forensics investigator, to prepare a comprehensive digital presentation that could be accessed and displayed during a live television broadcast. Your goal isn't just to expose Marcus's affair, Elena cautioned during their final preparation session. You need to present evidence of federal crimes serious enough that law enforcement will be forced to take immediate action. Once you go public with allegations of money laundering and murder conspiracy, Marcus and Victoria will become desperate, and desperate criminals are extremely dangerous. James had spent weeks compiling every piece of evidence they had gathered: recorded conversations, financial transfers, Victoria's true identity, communications with known criminal organizations, and documentation of the murder plot. Everything was organized into a presentation that could be triggered with a single command during the live television broadcast. The moment you present this evidence publicly, the FBI will be forced to act, James explained, handing Isabella an encrypted USB drive containing their entire case file. I've already contacted my former colleagues at the Bureau. They'll be standing by during the broadcast, ready to move the moment you provide legal justification for federal intervention. As the date of Marcus's television appearance approached, Isabella found herself entering an almost meditative state of focused determination. The terror and emotional devastation that had initially overwhelmed her had been transformed into cold, calculated fury. She was no longer a victim hiding from her husband's betrayal. She was a predator stalking the criminals who had threatened her child. The night before the broadcast, Marcus was unusually affectionate, bringing Isabella flowers and suggesting they have a romantic dinner at their favorite restaurant after his television appearance. "Tomorrow is going to change everything for us," he said, stroking her hair as they lay together in their bed for what Isabella knew would be the last time. "This deal with the international partners is going to set us up for life. Our son will never want for anything the best education, unlimited opportunities, complete financial security." Isabella closed her eyes and allowed herself to be held by this man who had once represented everything she wanted in a partner, knowing she was saying goodbye not just to Marcus but to the innocent woman she had been before learning the truth about their marriage. "I love you, Isabella," Marcus whispered into her hair, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine tenderness. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that you and our son are the most important things in my world." "I love you too," Isabella whispered back, and realized she was saying goodbye to the man she thought she had married, the life she thought she was living, and the future she thought they were building together. In 12 hours, the war would end, one way or another. The morning of Marcus's television appearance dawned clear and crisp. Manhattan's December sky, a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the darkness of Isabella's situation. She woke before her alarm, her son performing what felt like Olympic gymnastics in her increasingly cramped womb, as if he sensed the importance of the day ahead and was preparing to fight alongside his mother. Marcus was already in the shower, humming off-key as he prepared for what he believed would be his triumph on national television. Isabella lay still in their bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his morning routine, the electric toothbrush, the careful application of cologne, the selection of precisely the right tie for what she knew would be the last time. In 6 hours, their marriage would be over, one way or another. "Big day today," Marcus said as he emerged from their master bathroom, adjusting his Hermes tie with the practiced precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting his public image. He looked every inch the successful media mogul in his tailored Armani suit, his silver-streaked hair styled to perfection, his confident smile betraying none of the evil lurking beneath the polished exterior. "I'm so proud of you," Isabella replied, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth as she forced herself to sit up and help him with his cufflinks, a morning ritual they had shared throughout their marriage. "You're going to be absolutely brilliant on camera. You always are." Marcus captured her hands in his, bringing them to his lips in the gentle gesture that had once made her heart race with love and gratitude. "After tonight, everything changes for us. Isabella, I promise you, our lives are about to become everything we've ever dreamed of and more." The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. He was telling the absolute truth, just not in the way she was supposed to understand it. By tomorrow morning, Marcus would either be in federal custody or dead, and Isabella would either be free or joining him in whatever hell awaited them both. Isabella spent the morning in meticulous preparation, treating each detail like a military operation where the smallest mistake could cost her everything. She chose a black Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress that accommodated her 8-month pregnancy while maintaining an air of professional authority and sophisticated elegance. The color was deliberate black for mourning the death of her marriage, black for the funeral of her naivete, black for the widow she had almost become. Her makeup was applied with the precision of war paint, subtle but flawless foundation to hide the stress-induced pallor, carefully defined eyes to project strength and intelligence, lipstick in a shade that would show up clearly on television cameras. Her dark hair was swept back in a simple but elegant chignon that suggested both grace and determination. A woman who commanded respect and attention. Most importantly, Isabella prepared her evidence with the thoroughness of a prosecuting attorney building a capital case. Elena had provided her with a sleek leather portfolio containing hard copies of every document, photograph, and financial record they had compiled over the past 2 months. James's encrypted USB drive contained digital files that could be accessed instantly and projected for television audiences' email exchanges between Marcus and Victoria, bank records showing the money laundering operation, audio recordings of their murder conspiracy, and complete documentation of Victoria's true identity and criminal connections. Elena met Isabella at a discreet cafe near the television studio for their final strategy session, both women understanding that this might be the last time they spoke if the plan went wrong. "Are you absolutely certain about this approach?" Elena asked, studying Isabella's composed features, while her own expression revealed deep concern. "Once you walk into that studio and go public with these accusations, there's no turning back. Marcus will know everything you've discovered, and his reaction could be completely unpredictable." "I've been living with unpredictable for months," Isabella replied, sipping her chamomile tea with steady hands while her son kicked restlessly against her ribs. "At least this way, I'm controlling the narrative and the timing. At least this way, I'm fighting back instead of waiting to be murdered." James has been in contact with his former colleagues at the FBI. Elena continued, her voice low despite the cafe's background noise. "They'll be monitoring the broadcast and standing by for immediate response, but they can't take action until you present the evidence publicly. The moment you show those documents on live television, this becomes an active federal investigation." Isabella nodded, understanding the weight of what she was about to do. She wasn't just exposing her husband's infidelity or even his murder plot. She was taking down an international criminal conspiracy that had tentacles reaching across multiple countries and involving hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal transactions. "What about Victoria?" Isabella asked, unconsciously touching her belly as the baby responded to her stress with increasingly agitated movement. "James has been monitoring her communications and movements." Elena replied with a grim smile that suggested anticipation of justice. "She's planning to watch the broadcast from your penthouse, apparently. She's ordered champagne and flowers to celebrate Marcus's television success and your impending elimination. FBI agents will be positioned to arrest her the moment you provide them with legal justification." The irony was almost poetic. Victoria would be arrested in the very home she had planned to steal, surrounded by the life she had murdered to obtain, toasting her own downfall with champagne intended to celebrate Isabella's death. At 5:30 p.m., Isabella stood outside the Times Square studio where Business Tonight was filmed, watching the controlled chaos of live television production through the building's floor-to-ceiling windows. Technicians rushed between equipment checks with practiced efficiency. Producers barked instructions into their headsets with military precision, and makeup artists made final touch-ups on guests who would soon face the scrutiny of millions of viewers. Through the lobby's glass barriers, Isabella could see Marcus in the green room, reviewing his talking points with the supreme confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was laughing at something his publicist said, completely at ease in his element, radiating the kind of charismatic authority that had first attracted Isabella and convinced her to trust him with her heart and future. He had no idea that his wife was 30 feet away, about to destroy his life on national television. Isabella checked her phone one final time. Elena had texted, "FBI is in position, legal team standing by. Remember, you're not just fighting for yourself tonight. You're fighting for your son and every other woman Marcus and Victoria might victimize if they're allowed to continue their operations." At exactly 6:00 p.m., Business Tonight went live from Studio 4. Isabella watched from a corridor monitor as host Sarah Mitchell, a veteran journalist with 20 years of experience covering financial markets and corporate crime, introduced the evening's programming with her trademark blend of professionalism and subtle skepticism. "Tonight, we're speaking with Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Media Empire, about his company's ambitious expansion into emerging international markets," Sarah announced, her camera-ready smile warm but carrying the undertone of journalistic probing that had made her famous for exposing corporate fraud. "Mr. Wellington joins us fresh from closing what industry insiders are calling the most revolutionary media deal of the decade. Marcus entered the set with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to having his opinions treated as gospel truth. He shook Sarah's hand with just the right combination of respect and confidence, settled into the guest chair with relaxed authority, and looked directly into the camera as he began discussing market penetration strategies, synergistic acquisitions, and the visionary leadership required to build lasting media empires. Your personal life seems as successful as your professional achievements, Sarah commented approximately 15 minutes into the interview, her tone carrying the kind of practiced warmth that encouraged subjects to reveal more than they intended. You're expecting your first child with your wife Isabella, the former investigative journalist Isabella Rodriguez? How has impending fatherhood changed your perspective on business leadership and long-term strategic planning? Marcus's smile softened with what appeared to be genuine emotion, his entire demeanor transforming as he spoke about family and fatherhood. Isabella has been my anchor through everything. Sarah, she gave up a brilliant and successful career to support my dreams and ambitions, and now we're about to embark on the most important venture of our lives, raising our son together and building a legacy that extends far beyond business success. The words hit Isabella like physical blows, each sentence a masterpiece of manipulation that would have convinced her of his sincerity if she hadn't heard him planning her murder. Even now, even knowing what she knew, part of her wanted to believe that the tenderness in his voice was real, that some portion of their relationship had been genuine. Family comes first, always, Marcus continued, looking directly into the camera with the intensity that had first captivated Isabella. Isabella, if you're watching at home, I want you to know that I love you more than words can express. You and our son represent everything meaningful in my world, everything worth fighting for and protecting. This was the moment. This was her cue. Isabella straightened her shoulders, checked that her portfolio was secure in her hands, and walked toward Studio 4 with the measured pace of someone entering a courtroom to deliver testimony that would determine the fate of everyone involved. The security guard at the studio door started to intercept her, but Isabella smiled with confident authority and said, "Mrs. Wellington, my husband is expecting me to join him for the final segment." It was a complete lie, but delivered with such conviction that the guard stepped aside without question, allowing Isabella to enter the studio just as Marcus was saying. Building a media empire means nothing if you don't have someone to share it with, someone who believes in your vision and supports your dreams. Isabella has given me the greatest gift imaginable. Thank you, darling, Isabella interrupted, stepping into the blazing studio lights with her head held high and her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent space. But I think your viewers deserve to hear the complete truth about your gifts and the price you're willing to pay for them. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. Marcus's face went completely white, his confident smile freezing into a mask of shock and terror. Sarah Mitchell, with the razor-sharp instincts that had made her a legendary journalist, immediately sensed she was witnessing something extraordinary and potentially historic. "Mrs. Wellington," Sarah said smoothly, her professional composure intact despite the obvious drama unfolding before her. "This is certainly unexpected. Please join us and share whatever truth you think our viewers need to hear." Isabella moved with deliberate grace toward the guest area, her pregnancy making her movements careful but dignified. The studio fell completely silent except for the hum of cameras and equipment. Even the crew members had stopped their activities to watch what was clearly about to become television history. "Marcus was just telling your viewers about our marriage and how I sacrificed my career to support his success," Isabella said, settling into the chair across from her husband with calm authority. "What he didn't mention is that while I was home preparing for our child's arrival, he was planning my murder so he could steal our son and start a new life with his criminal accomplice." The studio erupted in controlled chaos. Producers spoke frantically into their headsets. Cameramen zoomed in for close-up shots, and Sarah Mitchell leaned forward with the predatory intensity of a journalist who recognized the story of her career unfolding in real time. "Mrs. Wellington, you're making extremely serious accusations," Sarah said carefully, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the legal implications of broadcast defamation. Do you have evidence to support such dramatic claims? I have everything, Isabella replied, opening her portfolio with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Recorded conversations, financial documents proving money laundering operations, evidence that Marcus's mistress is actually Victoria Blackwood, daughter of international fugitive Richard Blackwood, and complete documentation of their conspiracy to murder me and steal our child. Marcus finally found his voice, lunging forward in his chair with desperation that destroyed any remaining trace of his polished public image. Isabella, what are you doing? You're having some kind of breakdown. The pregnancy has been difficult. She's been experiencing severe psychological episodes and paranoid delusions. Play this, Isabella said, handing the USB drive to the nearest technician with calm authority. Let America hear what Marcus Wellington really thinks about his devoted wife and the mother of his child. The technician looked uncertainly toward Sarah, who nodded grimly as she recognized that journalistic history was being made in her studio. Moments later, Marcus's voice filled the space with crystal clarity, damning him with his own words. After Isabella gives birth, I'll file for divorce immediately. My lawyer already has the papers drawn up. Once the baby comes and I establish paternity for legal purposes, Isabella will have an unfortunate accident. Nothing traceable, of course. The color drained completely from Marcus's face as his own voice condemned him before 15 million viewers. In the control room, producers made split-second decisions to continue broadcasting live. This was the story of the decade unfolding in real time, and the public interest clearly outweighed any corporate concerns about controversy. These recordings were made in our home office, Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each revelation. Marcus has been conducting an affair with Victoria Blackwood while planning my death and the theft of our child. But what Marcus doesn't realize is that his girlfriend has been using him to launder money for her father's international criminal organization. She gestured toward the technician again with theatrical timing. Show them the financial records that prove Marcus Wellington has been complicit in a multi-billion-dollar money laundering operation. Marcus lunged desperately toward the USB port, but studio security was faster, restraining him as documents flashed across the studio's large screens, showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies and offshore accounts connected to known criminal enterprises. This is completely insane, Marcus shouted, struggling against the security guards while his careful public image disintegrated before a national audience. She's making all of this up. She's mentally unstable and needs immediate psychiatric intervention. Then explain this, Isabella said with devastating calm, producing a printed email from her portfolio and reading aloud in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the studio. Victoria to Marcus. Once that fat bitch is dead, we can move our operation to the Cayman Islands full-time. Daddy's contacts there will ensure the money stays clean and nobody asks awkward questions about the source. Sarah Mitchell, recognizing that she was witnessing the exposure of what appeared to be a major criminal conspiracy, took control of the situation with the authority that had made her a legend in broadcast journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we appear to be witnessing the real-time exposure of what could be one of the most significant criminal conspiracies in recent American history. She announced to the camera, Mrs. Wellington, you mentioned recorded conversations between your husband and his alleged accomplice. Can you provide additional evidence for our viewers? Play audio file number 7, Isabella instructed the technician, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. Victoria's voice filled the studio, cold and calculating as she discussed murder logistics with casual efficiency. Make sure the accident happens after the baby is born and you've established legal paternity. We need the inheritance laws to be crystal clear in our favor. And Marcus, don't go soft on me now. We've come too far to let sentiment ruin everything we've worked for. Sorry. Marcus stopped struggling against the security guards, his shoulders sagging in complete defeat as the overwhelming weight of evidence destroyed any possibility of denial or explanation. This wasn't a case of he said, she said, or competing narratives. This was his own voice and his accomplice's voice, recorded clearly and presented to a national audience with devastating effectiveness. The FBI has been monitoring this situation, Isabella announced, looking directly into the main camera with the authority of someone delivering a closing argument to a jury. Victoria Blackwood is being arrested at this very moment in our penthouse, where she was waiting to celebrate my husband's television appearance and my planned murder with champagne and flowers. As if responding to a perfectly timed cue, FBI agents entered the studio with the coordinated precision of a federal law enforcement operation. Special Agent David Park approached Marcus with the calm authority of someone who had made thousands of arrests involving high-profile criminals. Marcus Wellington, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, racketeering, and participation in a continuing criminal enterprise, Agent Park announced, producing federal handcuffs as he began the formal arrest process. The man who had strutted into the studio 90 minutes earlier as a respected business leader was now a federal criminal being processed on live television. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Marcus looked at Isabella with an expression that might have been genuine remorse, though it was difficult to distinguish from simple terror at the magnitude of his situation. "Isabella," he said quietly, his voice stripped of all its former authority and confidence. "I'm sorry. I loved you. I really did love you. I just got in too deep with Victoria, and she showed me possibilities, made promises. I never meant for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you." Isabella stood slowly, one hand protectively covering her belly as her son kicked restlessly in response to her elevated stress levels. She looked down at the man she had once loved more than life itself, the man who had represented everything she wanted in a partner and father for her children. "You had choices, Marcus," she said, her voice gentle but absolutely implacable. "Every single day, you chose money over family, power over love, Victoria over your wife and child. You chose to plan my murder rather than simply divorcing me honestly. Now you'll spend the rest of your life living with the consequences of those choices." As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his perfect hair disheveled, Sarah Mitchell turned to face the main camera with the poise of a veteran journalist who had just witnessed history. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just observed an extraordinary example of investigative journalism in action," she said, her professional composure intact despite the chaos that had transformed her business program into a crime drama. "Mrs. Wellington, you've just exposed what appears to be a major criminal conspiracy on live television, watched by over 15 million viewers. What happens now for you and your unborn child?" Isabella faced the camera, thinking of all the women watching who might be trapped in similar situations, who might feel as helpless and isolated as she had felt just weeks ago when she first learned of Marcus's betrayal. "Now I rebuild my life on a foundation of truth instead of lies," she said with quiet strength. "I raised my son to understand that justice sometimes requires courage, that integrity matters more than wealth, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones we need to protect ourselves from most vigilantly." She paused, looking directly into the camera with the intensity that had once made her a feared investigative journalist. "And I want every woman watching tonight to know that you are stronger than you think, braver than you know, and never as alone as you feel. If you're in danger, if you're being threatened or manipulated, there are people who will help you fight back. Don't let anyone convince you that you're powerless, because you're not." The studio erupted in spontaneous applause from the crew members, from Sarah Mitchell, from security guards and technicians who had just witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Phone lines at domestic violence organizations across the country would be flooded with calls from women who had found the courage to seek help after watching Isabella's courageous stand. In that moment, Isabella Rodriguez transformed completely from victim to victor, from betrayed wife to avenging angel, from prey to predator. The war was over, and justice had prevailed. But as she would soon discover, victory was just the beginning of a journey toward rebuilding a life worth living. 8 months after the broadcast that had changed everything, Isabella Rodriguez, she had legally reclaimed her maiden name within weeks of Marcus's arrest, stood in the nursery of her new penthouse overlooking Central Park, watching the morning sun filter through windows that had never known Marcus's presence. The space was decorated entirely according to her own taste, free from the oppressive luxury that had characterized her former life. Baby Alexander James Rodriguez slept peacefully in his crib, completely unaware that his first months of life had been accompanied by one of the most high-profile criminal trials in recent American history. At 6 months old, he was already displaying signs of his mother's determined personality, grasping toys with fierce concentration, fixing visitors with an intense stare that reminded Isabella of her own investigative instincts, and demonstrating the kind of robust health that suggested he would inherit his mother's resilience rather than his biological father's weakness. The legal proceedings had moved with unprecedented speed, aided by the mountain of evidence Isabella had gathered and the enormous public pressure generated by the viral video of Marcus's arrest. Within hours of the broadcast, the FBI had launched a comprehensive investigation that uncovered a criminal network spanning 12 countries, with Victoria's father, Richard Blackwood, at the center of a money laundering operation that had processed over $2 billion in illegal proceeds from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and arms dealing. Marcus's trial had been a media sensation that dominated news cycles for months. The man who had once commanded respect in boardrooms across America was revealed to be a weak-willed accomplice who had allowed greed, lust, and criminal manipulation to destroy not only his own life, but the lives of countless victims whose money had been laundered through his media empire. His testimony, given in exchange for a reduced sentence that still guaranteed he would spend the next 25 years in federal prison, had helped authorities dismantle the entire Blackwood organization and recover hundreds of millions of dollars for victims worldwide. 25 years minimum, Elena Vasquez said, settling into the comfortable armchair beside Alexander's crib with her morning coffee and the newspaper that still occasionally featured updates about the Wellington Blackwood case. Elena had become much more than Isabella's attorney. She was now her closest friend, romantic partner, and co-parent to Alexander, having legally adopted him as soon as New York law permitted. Isabella nodded thoughtfully, feeling surprisingly little satisfaction at the news of Marcus's sentencing. The man who had planned her murder was now facing the reality of spending the next quarter century in federal prison, emerging as a 70-year-old man with no money, no reputation, and no family. But Isabella found herself more focused on building her new life than dwelling on the destruction of her old one. "What about Victoria?" Isabella asked, though she already knew the answer from following the trial proceedings obsessively. 30 years, no possibility of parole for 15. Elena replied with obvious satisfaction. Judge Martinez was particularly harsh because of the pregnancy element and the fact that Victoria showed absolutely no remorse during the trial. Apparently, the judge has 3 daughters and took Victoria's callousness toward maternal life very personally. Victoria's trial had been even more damaging to her image than Marcus's proceedings. Unlike Marcus, who had at least shown some remorse during his testimony and cooperation with federal investigators, Victoria had maintained her innocence throughout the entire process, blaming everything on her father's influence while showing no understanding of or regret for the pain she had caused. The jury had seen through her performance completely, particularly after Isabella's powerful testimony about Victoria's cold calculation and casual cruelty during their single face-to-face encounter at the penthouse. The financial recovery had been both swift and comprehensive. The court had frozen all assets connected to the money laundering operation, but Isabella's legitimate inheritance from the portions of Wellington media empire that predated Marcus's criminal activities had been protected and returned to her. More importantly, she had used her investigative skills and legal resources to help authorities trace and recover funds for other victims of the Blackwood organization, earning recognition from federal law enforcement and international financial crime prevention organizations. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Elena said, her tone shifting to something more personal and intimate. "The New York Times has made a formal offer for you to write a weekly column. Justice Chronicles investigating financial crimes, exposing corruption, and giving voice to victims who can't advocate for themselves. It would come with complete editorial freedom, a substantial research budget, and the kind of platform that could really make a difference. Isabella considered the offer while watching her son sleep, his tiny fist curled around a stuffed elephant that had been a gift from one of the thousands of supporters who had written to express their admiration for her courage. For months, she had been flooded with interview requests, book deals, speaking engagements, and job offers from organizations that wanted to capitalize on her story and her newfound celebrity status. But few seemed to understand that her experience had been about much more than personal revenge. It had been about justice for all the women who lacked the resources, skills, or support systems necessary to fight back against similar threats. "I'm very interested," Isabella said finally, her voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that had sustained her through the darkest months of her ordeal. "But I want to focus primarily on helping other women in situations similar to what I experienced. This isn't about maintaining my public profile or building a media career. It's about using what I learned to protect others and prevent similar tragedies." The Strong Mothers Foundation had been Isabella's first priority after Alexander's birth and the conclusion of the criminal trials. Using the settlement money recovered from Marcus's seized assets and the donations that had poured in from supporters around the world, she had established a comprehensive organization that provided legal support, financial assistance, safe housing, and advocacy services for pregnant women escaping abusive relationships or facing threats from domestic partners. The foundation's first major case had been Sarah Chen, a pregnant woman whose gambling-addicted husband had been planning to sell their unborn child to pay his debts to loan sharks. Isabella's legal team had helped Sarah gather evidence, escape safely to a secure location, and prosecute her husband successfully while protecting her baby from the criminal conspiracy. The victory had felt even more satisfying than Isabella's own legal triumph, because it represented the beginning of a systematic effort to protect vulnerable women and children. "You fundamentally changed the national conversation about domestic violence and financial abuse," Elena observed, watching Isabella with the kind of obvious admiration that never failed to make Isabella's heart skip a beat. "Congressional hearings are citing your case as evidence for new federal legislation. 3 states have already passed laws specifically protecting pregnant women from financial manipulation and coercion. You've literally saved lives by speaking out." Isabella smiled, remembering the hundreds of letters she received weekly from women who had found the courage to leave dangerous situations after seeing her story, who had recognized similar warning signs in their own relationships, or who had simply drawn strength from her example of refusing to be a victim. "Alexander will grow up in a different world because of what you accomplished," Elena continued, reaching out to touch Isabella's hand with the gentle affection that had gradually developed between them over the months since Marcus's arrest. "He'll know his mother as a hero who fought for justice, not as a victim who accepted her fate quietly." The relationship between Isabella and Elena had developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine emotional connection rather than the passionate whirlwind that had characterized Isabella's relationship with Marcus. Elena understood and respected Isabella's need for independence, her dedication to her advocacy work, and her fierce protectiveness of Alexander. More importantly, she loved Isabella for who she truly was, including her strength, her intelligence, her determination, and her capacity for both justice and mercy, rather than trying to mold her into someone else's vision of an ideal partner. Their wedding had been a deliberately intimate affair in the garden of Isabella's house in the Hamptons, the one property from her marriage to Marcus that held only positive memories and had not been tainted by his criminal activities. Alexander had gurgled happily in Elena's arms during the ceremony, as if giving his approval to their new family configuration and the love that had grown between his two mothers. "Mrs. Rodriguez Vasquez," Elena said now, using Isabella's new hyphenated name with obvious pleasure and pride. "How does it feel to be married to someone who actually deserves your love and respect?" Isabella laughed, the sound carrying none of the bitter edge that had marked her voice during the dark months with Marcus and the criminal proceedings that followed. "It feels like coming home to myself," she said honestly. "It feels like being loved for who I actually am, instead of who someone wants me to become." The apartment's doorbell chimed softly, and Isabella checked the security monitor, a reasonable precaution she had maintained despite the elimination of immediate threats from Marcus and Victoria. Her mother, Carmen Rodriguez, stood outside with her arms full of packages and her face bright with the special joy that grandmothers reserve for spoiling their grandchildren. Mija, Carmen exclaimed as Isabella opened the door, immediately reaching for Alexander with the kind of expert confidence that came from raising 5 children of her own. How is my beautiful grandson today? Has he been good for his mamas? Carmen had been Isabella's emotional anchor throughout the entire ordeal, moving from Barcelona to New York to help with Alexander and provide the kind of unconditional family support that had sustained Isabella through the darkest moments of betrayal, legal proceedings, and single motherhood. She had also become Elena's biggest champion, frequently reminding anyone who would listen that her daughter deserved to be loved.